trans women are women. Why not?
Because they're men, because they're male.
Dig deeper for me.
If trans women were women, they wouldn't be trans. There's a reason why they're called trans women, and it's because they're not women, they're men. If we allow men to become a subcategory of women, there is no such thing as a woman, because that's the whole point of having definitions of words. The scary thing now is that, maybe 20, 30 years ago, transsexualism, as it used to be called, people were very aware that sex and gender were different. And that's what feminism in the second wave was trying to explain, that yes, we are biologically female, but that shouldn't mean that we should be treated in a way that's different to men in most respects. But now and people would argue, but sex and gender are the same, you should be treated because you're that way. But now people have gone back and said, actually, gender and sex are the same, and you can decide what sex you are too, because there's this whole sort of Judith Butler idea that sex isn't real either, and that not just gender is a social construct, but sex is a social construct too. And so now we've started breaking down, the idea is that you can start breaking down what sex means to actually it means nothing. That has serious issues for policy and women's rights. So in that sense, males, which I think are men, can never be women. And so trans women are not women, they're men.
What would you say to the pushback from someone that does believe in trans ideology when they say the genitals aren't indicative of your gender at all, and what's more important is that you feel like a woman, so therefore you are a woman?
Well, if feeling like a woman is what makes you a woman, I don't know what it feels like to be a woman. I just am one. When you ask these people, what does it feel like a woman, they can normally never point to anything other than stereotypes. And that's how we get back to, okay, so this is just regressive and talking about stereotypes. So the idea that it's a feeling, fine. If you want to say that you feel like a woman, fine. You go, I don't have an issue with people saying that. What I do have an issue with is people saying that that feeling then grants them permission to access female spaces.
Well, Felice was sat in this chair a couple of weeks ago and we talked about this, and I think I've slung out some phrase that it's the bipartisan left-right horseshoe of female coddling. And I think you're seeing that emerging more and more, that the left, the progressives, if they buy into trans ideology, the only argument they have a lot of the time is, I feel like this, insert stereotype. Then actually, you see an emergence of this on the right as well, where women are pushed towards staying in the kitchen and making a sandwich because of the same stereotypes. So it feels like this sort of goes all the way round when you get to the extremes, no matter what side it's on.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Yeah, I agree.
Tell me more about university. And we've spoken a bit already about free speech and it being clamped down on. Do you feel like that's just absolutely baked into the system in terms of not being able to disagree? Because before, a lot of people, I've sat in on a million different trans interviews or free speech interviews when I was producing Trigonometry. And the key thing that people always say is that before, it was encouraged to disagree with a teacher and have this robust discussion, whereas now that doesn't seem to be the case, as you've already told me.
Well, interestingly, and I don't know whether this is the same at different universities, but there's a policy that says their trans inclusion policy for academia is that trans people will not be painted in a negative light, and that there'll always be like we need to respect trans people's lives, make sure they're presented in a positive light, to make sure we avoid transphobia and prejudice. But I don't understand what the scope of that means, because then that could mean that gender critical views as things that can't be expressed in academia at university. So in that sense, it is baked into policy, in my opinion, because if we're not allowed to paint any trans person in a negative light, that means we can't talk about the fact that 60% of trans women in prison are in there for sexual violence. I mean, that's not saying that all trans women are sexual predators, but it is a fact that 60% of trans women or men who identify as women in prison as of April 2019. It's on a paper that was submitted as evidence to a parliamentary committee. That is government data. So if we can't even talk about that, because that could be seen as painting trans people in a negative light, then we can't have proper discussions. So in that way, it is baked in, I would say, from my interpretation of the policy.
And to ask you frustrating questions, but to just keep on probing into this, what would you say to someone that just says, you know, I mean, I'm a man, I feel like a woman, I want to be a trans woman, I don't really feel a need to go into their changing rooms, I'll use the, you know, disabled toilets or gender neutral toilets or whatever, and I don't feel like I'm doing any harm. What's the big deal, really? Should they just be allowed to live, let live?
Of course. People can live their lives however they want, as long as it doesn't infringe on other people's rights. And I believe that women, well, according to the Equality Act, females and males have the right to exclude the opposite sex on the basis of privacy, where that's appropriate. So yeah, it doesn't bother me at all. And actually, I admire trans people who accept that they are different. And that means that when I say trans people, I mean trans women specifically, acknowledge that they are male. And that means that they shouldn't have access to female-only spaces because they wouldn't be female-only spaces. So yeah, I don't have an issue with that at all.
You say trans people, I'm guessing you're alluding to gender dysphoric people if you don't actually believe in trans ideology.
I struggle with this one because I don't believe in transgender ideology, and people often say, oh, these people don't even believe that trans people exist. Of course, I believe there are people who say that they're trans, but it's the equivalent of saying, if I say that I don't believe in God and there's someone sat in front of me who believes that they were created by God, does that mean I don't believe they exist? Like, it's the same thing to me. So in that sense, of course, trans people exist in the same way, of course, Christians exist. I just don't believe in their own idea of themselves. Of course, gender dysphoria is a real thing, but gender dysphoria doesn't always mean you might identify as trans, and certainly doesn't mean that you are the opposite sex and that you were born in the wrong body.